Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by senior editor of The Athletic, Sunaya Sapurji. Sunaya is a senior editor for The Athletic in Canada. Previously, she has worked as a junior hockey reporter and editor for the Toronto Star and Yahoo Sports. Really informative conversation we have today with Sunaya. She wrote an article in 2017 titled Grassroots to Gold: How Countries Are Growing the Game and Building Better Players. I found it an extremely interesting article. She speaks about the development of youth hockey players in various countries. North America, of course, Canada and the US with long-term athletic development and the American development model. And then she looks at Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, contrasting the club model with the free market of North America. Really interesting article. It was a great conversation that we had. Hopefully you get a lot out of this from an information standpoint, development in terms and measures of Europe versus North America. And then hopefully sometime soon, Sunaya will write a follow-up to see how those countries are doing at the current day. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the podcast, Sunaya. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's going to be an awesome educational 45 minutes to an hour. But before we get started with the article that we're all curious to learn more about, I know you wrote it quite a while ago, but tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do now so our audience understands a little bit more about you?
So for a long time, I was a junior hockey writer and columnist. I had started at the Toronto Star, worked in the same field at Yahoo Sports. At Yahoo, I expanded from the covering just the OHL to the CHL and some NCAA stuff. And then when I moved to The Athletic, I continued doing that. But a couple of years ago, I moved over to the NBA side. So now I'm doing more basketball stuff, but I'm still trying to keep a hand in hockey when it comes to writing.
Excellent. Well, we're just going to parlay right into this. We're getting right off the get-go. I loved this article. I know it was written 6 years ago. It was a 7-part series titled Grassroots to Gold: How Countries Are Growing the Game and Building Better Players. Now, this was right at the onset of the 2018 World Junior Championships. Okay, so that was the timing here. First question right off the hopper, Sunaya. What was the impetus for you to write this article or articles?
So I've always been interested in hockey internationally, covering junior hockey for so many years. You meet people from other parts of the world, and having covered several World Junior tournaments, this was something that first off was interesting to me. The series initially started to look ahead to the World Junior Tournament, as you mentioned, that was coming up, and just looking at how these countries produce junior players. But it became clear, I think, early on that I'd have to expand the idea, because at that level, at the junior level, countries were doing very similar things and their overall principles were the same. So I thought I would look at kind of the development models and the challenges countries were facing. Also, at that same time, my son was 2 and he had just started skating. So there was some personal interest there.
That's
in
great.
understanding how things worked here in Canada and around the world, because I was scared of becoming, one of those crazy hockey parents. I thought, what, the more information I have before that process starts, the better off I'll be.
Outstanding. Well, I told you off air, but I'll tell you now on air. Thanks for writing it, because I thought it was an enriching, informative series of articles. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
Sharing information at the time amongst governing bodies seemed to be a revolving theme amongst these different countries, and we're gonna break down country by country the ones that you went over. This framework around long-term athletic development and American development model, very, very similar in structure, maybe identical, different name, right?
Mm-hmm.
At your time, before you wrote this article, what was your understanding of it? And then coming out of it, at least in North America, what changed?
So I knew bits and pieces at a very cursory level. Like I
Okay.
knew everyone was trying to push kids away from more push kids towards, I should say, multi-sport play versus sport
Sure.
specific or hockey specific training at a young age. For the ADM, I knew about the top levels of the program with the under 18 and the national team development program because of
Yeah.
my work in junior hockey. And I knew Bob Mancini at USA Hockey because he had coached in the OHL in Saginaw before going to USA Hockey. And then, like years ago, I had a conversation with Jim Bedard, who was the Detroit Red Wings goalie coach for many
Yep.
years, and he had played in Finland. And he had told me this story about one day when he was over in Finland, this guy just showed up out of nowhere and he was like, "Hi, I'm your goalie coach for the next week." And he was like, okay. And so he said it was great. And so I knew I wanted to learn more about how that worked.
Sure.
And at the same time, Canada had also, there had been a lot of talk around the move to cross ice hockey.
Yep.
And there was a lot of pushback going against that.
Sure.
So I knew very little, but I was coming into it from a place of learning. So I think this series kind of grew organically because I didn't really know what I was going to get out of it until I actually started doing it.
Outstanding. So let's break that down. You focused on several hockey hotbeds. I know there could be more to choose from, but USA, Canada, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. Okay.
Mhm.
If we could, let's start with the US and Canada. Your first series, USA Hockey Making America Great, and then Canada. From your article and the investigative journalism that you did, what were the similarities and potentially the differences in the Canadian and US? And maybe it's very similar. Again, you and I spoke off air. I look at it from as a hockey person, with my understanding right now of this and American development model and long-term athletic development, to me, they're the same superhero with a different cape, right? I mean, it's just a different verbiage, it's a different word, but it's the same underlying framework.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities between the two countries and their philosophies. And I think they have a similar system in that it's a group of associations versus the club system that they have in Europe.
Sure.
I think they face a lot of the same problems as well in terms of making sure the game is still affordable, keeping as many kids involved in hockey as possible, growing the game and making sure it's fun. And I think that was something that was really jarring to hear when Bob Mancini was talking about having to use the word engagement instead of fun when he was talking to coaches and parents because some of the adults in traditional markets, took it so seriously that they would roll their eyes at the concept of fun. So I think it's sometimes hard to remember that hockey should be about having fun and being active and the social aspect and being part of a team and all of the lessons and skills that go along with that, and that it's not about making the next Sidney Crosby or Connor McDavid because those players are so rare. But I think there are more similarities than not. I think it starts to differ is when you get to maybe the higher levels, when you get
Okay.
to the national team development program in the US, which is like the centralized group of elite U17 and U18 players that play in the USHL. Whereas, in Canada, most of them, the elite players will play in the CHL. So I think that's kind of where it differs a bit
Sure.
in the centralization. But for minor hockey, I think it's very similar.
It just makes intuitive sense, right? Cross ice, more puck touches, more opportunities to be engaged in the game. Um, the scaling effect. I mean, I know I use a funny example, right? You wouldn't go to a grade school and use an adult urinal, right? Like it's a scaling, right? It's the same thing with the ice. Practice plans, small stations as opposed to full ice, utilizing your resources. I think the what I at least can perceive as the big ideas behind this is number one, don't specialize too early, right? And number two, when I say fun, I think you can develop and have fun at the same time, meaning you can teach skills, requisite skills on the ice and have fun. And you can do that smartly by scaling the package for younger kids. Does that make sense? Would you agree with that?
I would for sure. And I think what the goal was not to make hockey a chore, to make
Huh.
the drills a chore, especially if I know in Canada, kids are on the ice a lot more than they used to be. It's almost a 12-month
Yep.
a year season. And so I think when they talk about fun, it's about preventing burnout
Sure.
more than anything, and making sure kids are engaged and enjoying the sport if they're going to be playing it as much as they are now.
And we're going to touch on it towards the end of our interview, Sanaya. But this was a quote in the article, and the question really is at the onset is, and I say this, I don't call this a model, I call it a framework. And here's what I mean: a model can be empirically tested. You can't test something like this. There's too many confounders. It's a framework. It's ideas. This is my opinion, of course. But what is the measurement of success on something like this? And it seemed to revolve, I'm not putting words in your mouth, right? Around this idea, at least Hockey Canada and the USA Hockey, of retention, right? And this was a quote from, oh gosh, this was Ken Martell's quote. He said, "Our growth is coming in adults and girls hockey." And let's keep in mind, this was 2017. Okay. Martell said, "We actually dropped almost 50,000 male youth hockey players in our enrollment, which was a huge number of kids from where we were at previous. For a sport like us, that's always been a bit of a core business." And then this is a quote from Mancini: "The usual suspects, rising cost, burnout, fear of injury, quantity and quality of coaching, and an overall lack of fun were a big part of the problem." So in Canada, would those things, would that be one of the same in terms of what you learned in terms of the North American issues facing LTAD and this proposed framework?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, cost was a huge one. And I think that was across the board in every country I spoke to. Cost was definitely a big part of it. And not only financial cost, but the time cost
Sure,
of, taking kids to the rink, for practice and games and all of, skating coaches and all of that other stuff. Because in North America, I think the system is a bit different in that there is a secondary economy
yep,
in
yep,
terms of private skills coaches, skating
sure,
coaches, and all of that other extra developmental stuff that goes on outside of your minor hockey team.
sure.
So that was a big factor in it as well. The time cost of it.
100. And then you have something that just came at us, relatively recently, which is COVID, which massively impacts that all. This is a tough sport when it comes to that. I look at it from an uncle standpoint, right? A former player standpoint. I mean, a new pair of skates, my gosh, for a young kid, sticks now. And then the ability of like, look, if you want to play basketball or soccer, you can head to the park and go play. Ice now is a sacred commodity. And the cost of ice, I can only speak in the demographic that I live in, only continues to rise. So it is a very problematic issue facing young kids, the cost of playing the game.
And what happens if you have a goalie?
There you go. Double that, right? I I want to shift here, and we're going to come back to retention rates at the end. I know you and I will talk a little bit about those numbers, but let's move to Denmark now. Population of 5.9 million, 4,500 registered hockey players at the time. I know this was 2017. Briefly, before we start into Denmark, compare and contrast. I know most of our listeners will know this answer, but I want it coming from you. What is the difference between the club model that the Europeans use and this quote unquote free market or volunteer model in North America?
So basically, the club model is, it's what Denmark uses. So basically, if you had a young child
Yep,
starting in hockey and you lived in Aalborg, they would start playing with the Aalborg Ice Hockey Club, and they would play all of their hockey in that system and move up in that club. And then, at U14, you'd move from like their youth program into their senior program. And then in Denmark, because they don't really have the infrastructure there at this point, we would most likely have to leave Denmark and either go to Sweden or the CHL, because the development system isn't really quite there yet. So,
Yep.
often you'll see some of their best players go elsewhere to take that next step. But the interesting thing for me is the club model in a lot of these countries is a not-for-profit system. They will collect fees from players, and they have things that they run throughout the year, tournaments and such. And if there's any money left over, all of that money goes back into the club. It's buying loaner equipment, ice, all of that stuff. So that was kind of interesting to me to learn about how that works versus kind of this free market
Yep.
system that we have in North America.
Today's episode has been brought to you by Physical Preparation for Ice Hockey, Biological Principles and Practical Solutions, and the Gain Go Grow Manual. This is a two-part book series exploring training the intermediate and advanced level players. Book number 1 explores training the intermediate player. Chapters include long-term athletic development, considerations, speed training, power training, strength training, and program design. The Gain Go Grow Manual explores training the high-performance hockey player. Chapters include biomechanics of ice hockey, considerations for high performers, minimizing adaptational risks while upsizing gains, the Gain Go Grow model, and example microcycles. More information can be found at Amazon.com.
I think the challenges are uniquely different too. I think a lot of times when people speak about long-term athletic development or ADM, they're comparing apples to oranges. When you look at the European model and the US model, they're very different. And the other thing I think is really important here that we need to disseminate, the European models also typically have what they call vertical integration in their coaching. So those coaches who, again, these are smaller population countries. The US, 360 million compared to the population of Denmark, which is 5.9 million, where you
Definitely.
really get the quality, the former players, the goalies. We'll get to Finland in a second, where you have a targeted, regimented developmental program for these kids. Whereas in North America, I can speak for where I live. You got some volunteers that their hearts are in the right place. They want to be with their kids, but it's much more difficult in terms and measures because they're getting introduced to the game for the first time as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the population thing is huge.
Sure.
And but I think that's also a two-way street in that
Okay.
when we're talking about retention rates and bringing new people to hockey, if you're in Finland and Sweden, you cannot afford to lose a single player.
Sure.
Whereas if you're in Canada or the US, obviously you want to keep all the players that you have and welcome more in, but just the pool is so much bigger to kind of cast your line, so to speak.
And I think we're sticking with Denmark here, and this is a kind of a repetitive theme with the European the systems. But there was several individuals, players now in the National League. Freddie Anderson, goaltender, Bjorkstrand now for the Seattle, and he talked about, this was a quote from an individual, Jesper Duus, a director of Danish ice hockey. He said, "It's a small family. I don't think it's a coincidence that those guys do have fathers who are coaches and played themselves. They passed on some expertise, and I'm not sure if it's all about tactical things, but and that kind of stuff. It's more about the advice that they gave to the kids, the right advice, the right way." I'm paraphrasing. So again, you get a really close knit, lot smaller hockey community, but you're able to have, for lack of a better word, a little bit more expertise and backgrounds. Would you agree
Yeah,
with that?
for sure. And I mean, the hockey community in Denmark is so small that it is like you mentioned, like a lot of their coaches are former players who either played in Denmark or elsewhere in Europe or even in North America. And when they come back, they want to give back to the community and they start coaching their kids and other kids. And so
Sure.
it kind of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost
Yep.
of skill development in a country like Denmark because it's so small. And because the other thing is countries like Denmark, like Sweden, not so much Finland because hockey is the main sport there, but those countries are also fighting with other sports for the best
Sure.
app. It's not like Canada where or Finland, where hockey is king, and that's just the sport all kids, want to play when they grow up. There are other sports that are culturally, I think, more significant in some of those countries, that they have to fight with soccer for athletes, and they have to fight with handball for athletes.
Sure.
So it's not just that kids will naturally gravitate to hockey in those countries.
Well put. Let's shift ever so slightly. Finland and Sweden. So Finland, population of 5.5 million, just over 76,000 registered at the time. I get it, right? Sweden, population 9.8 million, 64,000 players registered at the time. 10% of the National Hockey League players were Swedes. Wow. Again, not comparing apples to apples. It's an apples to oranges comparison. This idea of quality versus quantity. I'm going to give a quote here. The same model exists for skaters, except that there are even more coaches and resources. In 2013, the FIHA, the Finnish International Hockey Association, I believe, if I'm correcting that, I'm not wrong, started providing the top clubs in Finland with a yearly subsidy to hire skill coaches to work specifically with children ages 10 to 14, the prime time for skill development. Seems like, again, we're crossing over here this European model, but obviously that's going to be done, through, it's a smaller population. But you had experience also with the goaltending in Finland. Could you share some of your experiences there? I mean, they have personal goaltending coaches with their clubs teams as well, correct?
Yes, that's right. So basically, as it was explained to me, the Finnish goaltending model is it's a layered approach to coaching. So
Okay.
each club team, you have a goalie coach at every level. So if you're playing in Karpat, you've got a goalie coach for U8, U10, all the way up. And then in addition to those coaches, there are FIHA appointed goaltending mentors who work in Finland's 8 regions. And basically they visit teams in their areas, run courses for coaches, and help instruct goaltenders. And then on top of that, there are 2 goaltending specialists who are full-time paid employees of FIHA who go around to different regions and work with both those goalie coaches and goalies. So those specialists are working with everyone. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a U8 goalie or if you're a professional goalie. And I think their job is not only to help with development, but to also make sure that there's consistency in messaging and in focus. And that's directly coming from FIHA.
Wow. So it's a targeted approach.
Very much so.
Let's piggyback on that as well. And I know this both in Sweden and in Finland. Education was massively important. Hot stoves, on-site hot stoves, which to me, I think is brilliant, right? Like, if your kid's already at the rink, you're at the rink, right? Did you learn more about those, how important those were in terms of both the education from the parent or the player? Was that something that was really focused on in the Scandinavian market?
Very much so. Like in Finland, they have goaltending specific courses. So in Finland, everybody plays in net. So they have specific coaching for parents, but it's basic. It's for kids,
Sure.
so it's basic. But it's things like how to put on pads properly, how to tie your skates properly, and if you're new to goaltending or new to hockey, these are things that parents don't know
Of course.
necessarily. What the proper stance should be. And
Yep.
so they're teaching parents on basically how they can help their kids at the most basic level. But the other thing is, in Sweden, there's a push to have more new immigrants to Sweden
Yes.
pick up hockey. So
Yes.
one of the things that they're doing in Sweden is, when your kid comes to play hockey at the rink, they will have classes where you can learn Swedish for parents. So it's not just about using these hot stoves for just hockey. It's kind of building a community as well off the ice. But they're doing some interesting stuff in Sweden. Like, one of the things that they decided to do in terms of making sure kids are learning and developing skills is they got rid of standings and individual scoring.
Yep.
And I remember having a conversation with someone in the Swedish Ice Hockey Federation who said, like, years and years ago, their development model was like a pyramid where it was designed to help the best players rise to the top. But they were having lots of retention issues doing that. And so they couldn't afford to lose anyone. So he explained that eventually they decided to change their thinking, where they wanted their model to be more like a square, where the best players are still moving to the top, but everyone is still playing, and they want to keep kids playing hockey for life. Essentially,
Sure.
it's not just about developing the best players or having people move to the top. It's just about having good experiences and making sure people stay in hockey.
Excellent, and well put. That was a great underline that I had in the article as well. That part series, the pyramid as opposed to the rectangle, I believe you quoted. Let me
Oh,
ask you off the yeah, either it was a square rectangle, either or. But let me ask you this: this is not a pre-written question that we've had, but and maybe there wasn't any, with the exception of this club model and the smaller populations. But what would you say your biggest contrasts were in the models from North America and Europe? Was it just that club model approach? And then let me ask you another question. Were you able to see practice plans as to what we spoke off air, right?
yes.
This idea of the interpretation of long-term athletic development. I mean, I could look at a U6 or a U8 practice plan in Ohio, and that might be interpreted very differently in Sweden or in Michigan or in Boston, which is a challenge, of course, right? Were you able to see any of those developmental practice plans, and was there contrast in those, if there was any?
No, I think what kind of struck me the most, and I think you just kind of touched on it a little bit, was just how difficult the change was
Yes.
at the federation level. Like the amount
Okay.
of bureaucracy and red tape involved in change, especially
Sure.
with the bigger hockey nations, and
Yep.
then the acceptance of that change. Because you could have all of the data and science backing you,
Yep.
but people would still be resistant. And when it was explained, how having smaller ice games improves number of touches, gets more kids involved, helps them make decisions faster, helps them react faster. There were so many benefits as opposed to playing full ice
Of course.
at
Yeah.
young ages, but yet there were still people screaming at Bob Mancini in parking lots or sending hate mail to Hockey Canada. And I think that was true in Sweden too when they got rid of the standings and the scores, because they wanted to focus more on skill development versus wins and losses.
Sure.
That was something that was interesting to see, was how much smart hockey people have to fight against the status quo when they're trying to do, I guess, what's right for kids or what's beneficial for their long-term development.
Awesome. All right. Final pivot here. I'm putting you on this one, Sanaya, because you're writing a part two. I think so it's going to be after the fact, and you're going to say it's that son of a you know what, Anthony Donskoff. He's had me. He's going on a wild chase here. 6 years after the fact, where are we? I know you're now writing for basketball, so maybe an unfair question. Maybe it's an opinionated question. This is your gut feel where you live in your neck of the woods. Do you feel the needle has moved? And it doesn't have to be, a hard number, meaning the retent. But do you feel that it's that change?
I think it's hard to say, especially when you look at the pandemic and the after effect of
Yep.
having so many players lose one, or in some cases two full seasons of development. If you want to talk about retention rates, do you want to talk about retention rates
Let's
now?
do it. Go right ahead. Yeah, let's do it. Well, you and I sent you that link on Project Play for the U.S. and I can speak for the U.S., but that was government collected information, much of it surveying. I know this is none of it's perfect science, right? But correct me if I'm wrong. You might be looking at it. The ages of specifically 6 to 12 for the U.S. ice hockey
Yeah.
participation were in a delta of 17.5%. right? So we're down 17.5%. In Canada, you were going to tell me something, and you said it's starting to move south, correct?
Yeah. So I was looking at the retention rates, and when I was looking at the rates, they weren't too bad, but their overall registration numbers are some of the lowest we've seen in 15 plus years. Like in the 22-23 season, there were 550,137 players enrolled, and that's a 14.5% drop from the 2018-19 season. And that's huge.
Yeah, it is. It is.
USA Hockey is going through the same thing, though their numbers are slightly better. I think overall total numbers, they've seen a 2% decrease in their latest total registration numbers. But as you said, like that key age range of 6 to 12 is where they seem to have really been hit with that 17.5% decrease. That's a lot of kids at critical ages.
Big time. Let me ask you this: challenges. I'm speaking as a coach now. No model or framework is perfect. I did some due diligence. I had an interesting guest, Sanaya, on probably 2.5 weeks ago. Yeah, this is a strength coach that's been coaching for 30 years, and he talked about some of the limitations for this idea of long-term athletic development. No model's perfect, no framework's perfect. And then I read some follow-up articles, and one was a survey based, and they talked about coaches being surveyed, and they said their biggest concerns right now were a misinterpretation of the model and this idea of volume over technique. Meaning, let me give you an example. You can have a lot of fun but still learn a skill, as opposed to your practice being constant play at the expense of any technical. So those were some challenges, and I looked back, I thought, hey, interesting, from a seasoned coach, and then some of this from the research, of course. Perhaps that's just me on the ground floor looking at it as a hockey person, and that's going to be a challenge, I think, all the time, because we're living in North America with that kind of model. Do you see any challenges like that? I know, again, you're looking at this from a journalistic standpoint, but do you see any challenges with that, or is the answer education?
No, I think I do, and I think some of that is messaging
Sure.
also,
Yep.
because you've got this big federation at the top making these decisions, and then it has to filter all the way through down all of these levels to
Yep.
the coaches that are kind of on the ground floor. And so I
Yep.
think sometimes, and I know that was a big part of the problem with the cross ice fiasco in Canada when they were trying to implement that, was that the messaging was off, and kind of nobody really knew when
Sure.
it was going to be implemented and when it wasn't. So I think one of the other problems is when you talk about that is making sure that there's a clear and consistent message, which I think is sometimes hard to do when
Sure.
you're such a big country, geographically speaking, and also with so many players and different associations to keep track of.
Well, I can tell you, I agree with that, and that was part of that article that I read. And one of the concerns, like I said, was a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of that article or of the LTAD. Another thing I want to put you up to, if you write this article, I'm just curious. Okay, this is where, if you write this follow up, I'm putting pressure on you, Sanaya. I want you to look at practice plans of the different countries based on age demographic. Here's another concern of mine as a hockey coach person. Okay, I look at this from a science standpoint: motor skill acquisition. To learn a motor skill at the ages of 6 to 8 is critical, right? The brain's going haywire, neurons that fire together, wire together. We've heard the science on that. Okay, so there's a big balance or teeter-totter of what we call block practice and random practice. Block practice means that if I have your son on the ice and he comes to a station of mine, I might spend that 7 minutes on passing. Now, we can have fun doing that. It might be stationary, it might be moving around. Random practice means that we're playing games and he's working on passing, shooting, moving, dodging, weaving. And what a lot of the motor skill research would say, that to attain a motor skill would take more of a blocked approach, right? You need to do it and do it over again. To retain a motor skill would take more of a chaotic approach. That means like a gameplay, right? My big concern, not concern is the wrong word, but question when I look at these practice plans is it's hard to attain a motor skill or retain, excuse me, a motor skill that you don't already have. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Can I ask you a question, Anthony?
Sure.
How does creativity factor into that?
Great question. I think it does, and I think it needs to. And again, I think it has to be balanced to me, right? So where does creativity figure in? I think you have to work on the baseline skills, having fun doing it, right? And then you put those kids in the environment to use those skills. So for example, if we're drawing up a 6-station practice plan for a young kid, I might have 3 of those stations blocked practice. They're still moving around. And then 2 or 3 of those stations more random where they're moving around, where they're playing games. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So yeah, you have the confidence once the game's being played, if that makes any sense. And it's not a perfect science. And I think that happens with the expertise of coaching, if that makes any sense.
Oh, for sure. I mean, when I was talking about Finland, a lot of what they're doing is not just coaching players, but coaching coaches to make sure, that they have the skills and the tools to help the players that they're coaching.
100%. And I think that's, again, I know Hockey Canada and I know USA Hockey is doing their jobs. It's a hard job because unlike the Finnish players, who most of them are former players, like I said, we talked about this before, you get the hockey dad that's his heart is in it for the right place. He wants to be with his kid, but it's also his first time on the ice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. I don't know if
it's a challenge, which is another challenge, right? Is educating the coaches. And I could talk with you forever about that in terms of both the classroom and the apprenticeship model of getting on the ice with the coaches.
Yeah. And I can also say it's mostly a thankless job too.
100%. 100%. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. I am putting pressure. I know you might not write a follow-up, but I would love if you were to write a follow-up 6 years after and continue to talk about this development and where we're at in the model. It's an ever-changing, ever-evolving framework. I think it's very good in terms and measures of creating these easy-to-use reference ranges for kids from a developmental standpoint. Iteration's key. That's how we improve models. We make mistakes. We continue to correct them, right? Mm-hmm. Tell us what's next for you and your endeavors. What are you writing next? Maybe is a better question.
I'm not sure yet. Yeah, I haven't thought of what my next big piece is going to be. But now that you've put a follow-up in my mind, maybe I'll get started on that.
Well, I appreciate it. Our guest today has been Sunaya Sapurji. Sunaya, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Anthony.